The mahogany clock on the wall of Gerald Pittman's office had been ticking for 11 minutes before he opened the folder. Eleanor Hargrove had counted every single one of them. She sat in the high-backed leather chair with the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 4 decades learning how to wait for dinner guests to arrive, for school plays to begin, for her husband to come home from trips that always ran 3 days longer than scheduled. Waiting was the skill she had perfected above all others, and she deployed it now in this grey Boston office, while the October rain pressed itself flat against the tall windows and the city beyond dissolved into a smear of pewter and bruised violet. 14 days. That was the precise distance between the life Eleanor had known and this room. 14 days since she had looked out the kitchen window at 5:47 in the morning and seen Walter collapsed face down in the snow, the red-handled shovel still upright beside him, like a grave marker he had accidentally placed himself. The paramedics had used words like sudden and massive, and nothing you could have done, and Eleanor had nodded at each one as though they were items on a grocery list. She was mentally checking off because the alternative, really absorbing what those words meant, was not something she could afford to do in a driveway in front of neighbors who were already watching from behind their curtains. The funeral had taken 11 of the 14 days to organize, execute, and survive. She had chosen the casket, selected the hymns, shaken approximately 200 hands, accepted approximately 400 casseroles, and slept on her side of the king-size bed, with the precise, disciplined rigidity of someone who understood that if she rolled toward the center, something would break that could not be repaired. She had done all of this because Walter had always told her she was the capable one when it came to people, to logistics, to the soft machinery of life. He handled the numbers. She handled everything else. She had come to Gerald Pittman's office expecting a formality. The word itself had a comfortable weight to it, the weight of paperwork that confirmed what she already knew. The house on Elmwood Drive paid off, the retirement account substantial, the life insurance policy robust. Walter had told her these things in the oblique, reassuring way he discussed finances, not with specifics, never with specifics, but with a calm authority that made specifics feel unnecessary. "Trust me, Ellie. I've built us something solid." She had trusted him the way you trust the foundation of a house you've lived in for 38 years. You don't inspect it, you simply walk across the floors. Diana sat beside her, and Eleanor was aware of her daughter's presence, the way you're aware of weather, not quite consciously, but registering it in the body. Diana was 34 and had inherited Walter's jaw and Eleanor's eyes, a combination that had always produced a face of striking contradictions, strong and watchful at once. She was tapping one manicured fingernail against the armrest, a small rhythmic percussion that she likely didn't know she was making. Eleanor considered reaching over to still her daughter's hand, then decided against it. Diana's restless energy was doing something Eleanor's grief could not currently manage. It was keeping the room awake. Gerald Pittman cleared his throat. He was 61 years old and had handled Walter's business affairs for the better part of a decade. And in that time, Eleanor had encountered him at perhaps 4 social functions, where he had always been jovial and a little theatrical in the way of men who enjoyed performing competence. He was not performing anything now. He was studying the folder on his glass desk with the focused attention of a man reading a document he wished he'd had the courage to refuse. "Eleanor." His voice had lost its rehearsed warmth entirely. What remained was something thinner, more clinical. "I want to preface this by saying that I served as executor of the documents Walter filed with this office. I was not privy to the full scope of his financial decisions over the last several years." The cold started at the back of Eleanor's neck. Not fear exactly, something more precise than fear. A premonition arriving a moment too late to be useful. "Gerald." Her voice was quiet and completely level. "Just read it." He read it. The legal language was dense and carefully structured, and as the clauses accumulated, each one building on the last, with the grim architectural logic of a collapsing building. The shape of what Walter had done began to materialize in the room, like something that had always been there, waiting for the right angle of light to make it visible. The house at 412 Elmwood Drive in Concord, Massachusetts. The house where Eleanor had stripped wallpaper and planted hydrangeas and taught Diana to ride a bicycle on the front path, was encumbered by two home equity lines of credit, both in default. The combined debt exceeding current market value by a margin that made Diana's sharp intake of breath perfectly audible in the silence of the office. The joint savings accounts had been systematically drained. The retirement portfolio Walter had referenced in general reassuring terms for 20 years was in its current state functionally empty. And the life insurance policy, the one Eleanor had last thought about when Walter had shown her the original documents in 1989, fanning the pages like a magician revealing a trick, had its beneficiary designation quietly changed 3 years ago to a limited liability company registered in Delaware under the name Crestwood Partners. Diana was on her feet. "That is impossible." The words came out with a force that seemed to surprise even her. "My father saved aluminum foil. He reused sandwich bags. He drove a 6-year-old Buick because he said new cars were a psychological trap. He did not take out secret mortgages on the family home." Gerald opened his hands in a gesture that acknowledged her certainty without sharing it. The signed documents were in the folder. The signatures had been verified. Walter had begun liquidating their shared life with the same methodical precision he applied to his client audits systematically over years, leaving no single transaction large enough to trigger alarm. Eleanor didn't hear the rest, not because she lost consciousness or descended into shock in any dramatic sense, but because her mind performed a quiet protective act of translation, converting Gerald's words into something like background sound. The way a long-married person learns to hear the television in the next room without actually listening. She sat in the chair. She kept her hands folded. She maintained the precise posture she had walked in with, because some part of her understood that if her posture broke, everything would break with it. And she was not prepared to do that here in this office in front of a man who was looking at her with an expression she recognized and despised pity, with a clean exit. She was aware of Diana's voice rising and then modulating of Gerald, responding in the careful subdued register of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. She was aware of her own breathing, which remained steady. She was aware of the rain against the windows, which did not stop. What she was not aware of until she was already standing on the sidewalk outside with Diana's arm through hers and the cold October air sharp in her lungs was that she had not cried. Not once. Not a single tear in that office, not in the elevator, not when Diana pulled her close on the front steps while the doorman pretended to look elsewhere. The grief was there. She could feel it the way you feel a bruise that hasn't surfaced yet, deep and structural. But something else had moved in front of it. Something that had no name yet but occupied the same space in her chest, where panic should have been. Diana drove. Eleanor watched Concord materialize through the passenger window. The familiar elms, the white church steeple, the hardware store, where Walter had spent entire Saturday mornings buying equipment for projects he never finished. The ordinary persistence of a town that did not know it had changed. Diana reached over once and gripped her mother's hand without speaking, and Eleanor squeezed back and let go, and they drove the rest of the way in silence. That was not empty, but full of all the things that couldn't be said yet because neither of them had the vocabulary for what had just happened. What had just happened was this: Eleanor Hargrove, 68 years old, had been erased from her own life. Not by accident, not by misfortune, not by the kind of financial tragedy that arrives without warning and without malice, but deliberately over years by the specific patient intention of the man she had ironed shirts for, nursed through pneumonia, defended to her own mother, when the early years were hard, and chosen every single day for 38 years to believe. Back at the house on Elmwood Drive, she moved through rooms that already felt reclassified. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a sound that now seemed to be counting down rather than simply marking time. The Persian rug in the living room, The oil painting of the main coastline above the fireplace, the set of china in the cabinet that they had used exactly twice, these were no longer possessions. They were evidence. She did not eat. She did not turn on the television. She sat at the kitchen table in the gathering dark and let the question that had been circling since Gerald's office finally land. Not how, though. The how would matter later, and not what now, though. That would matter most of all. But why? Why had Walter done this with such patience, such architectural care, over such an extraordinary length of time, and managed to look her in the face across the dinner table every night for years while carrying the weight of it? What did a person do with that question? Where did you file it? When the only person who could answer it was already in the ground. She didn't have an answer. What she had instead, as she finally rose from the table and climbed the stairs to the bedroom she no longer knew how to sleep in, was a feeling she couldn't quite identify, not yet. Something beneath the grief, beneath the anger, beneath the cold, practical terror of facing eviction at 68. Something harder than all of those things. It would take her 9 more days to find its name. The physical work of dismantling a life is nothing like grief counselors describe it. There is no gentle unwinding, no dignified sorting of memories. It is paper cuts and aching knees and the particular indignity of wrapping in newspaper a ceramic bowl you have eaten cereal from for 2,000 mornings, then placing it in a box for strangers. Eleanor worked through the house with the systematic determination of someone who had decided that movement was the only alternative to stillness. And stillness was the enemy. Diana came every other day. She brought coffee and grocery bags and her laptop, and she set herself up at the kitchen table with the focused intensity of someone who had redirected their grief entirely into research. It was Diana who called the bank and requested 5 years of account statements. It was Diana who cross-referenced Walter's stated travel schedule against the credit card records, marking in red highlighter every transaction that appeared in a city he had claimed to be visiting, and every transaction that appeared somewhere he had never mentioned. And it was Diana who first noticed the pattern of a New York State IP address logging into Walter's personal email account, an average of 4 times per week for the past 7 years. Not Walter's IP address, a different one, consistent, habitual, like someone checking in on an investment. Mom! Diana set her highlighter down one afternoon near the end of the first week. Dad had a regular connection to upstate New York, something consistent over years. I can't prove what it is yet, but it's there in the data every single week. Eleanor paused in her packing, a wrapped soup bowl in both hands. She looked at her daughter across the kitchen and felt something shift in the back of her mind. A small internal door swinging open onto a corridor she hadn't known existed. She didn't say anything. She went back to wrapping the china. It was the 9th day after the funeral, a Tuesday in late October with a sky the color of old pewter, when Eleanor finally descended to the basement. She had been avoiding it, and she knew she had been avoiding it. And she had permitted herself the avoidance because there had always been something more urgent. Another room to clear. Another call from the bank to endure, another neighbor arriving with condolences that required her to perform a grief she was actually feeling, but in a register too complicated to display on demand. But she knew in the honest part of herself, she could access most clearly at 3 in the morning when the house was absolutely silent, that the deeper reason was simpler. Walter had always made her feel unwelcome there. Not aggressively, not with confrontation. Walter had never raised his voice in 38 years, which was one of the things she had always considered among his finest qualities, and now understood differently. He had done it quietly, persistently, with affection. That workshop was his sanctuary, he always said with a pat on her cheek. Every man needed a sanctuary. She had accepted this as reasonable as one of the small private territories that a long marriage accumulates and accommodates. She had no such accommodation now. She went down the stairs with a box of heavy-duty trash bags and the specific intent of a woman who had run out of deference. The smell hit her first: motor oil sawdust, the faint metallic undertone of aging steel tools. Walter's pegboard hung on the far wall, every wrench and screwdriver outlined in black marker, so each tool could be returned to its precise position. An organizational system so meticulous, it now seemed less like order and more like performance. Here is a man who controls his environment. Here is a man who accounts for everything. Look how carefully he accounts for everything. She started at the heavy oak workbench along the back wall, dragging rusted implements into trash bags without ceremony. The anger that had been building for 9 days, the cold architectural anger, nothing like the hot operatic kind she might have expected from herself, found a physical channel in the work. She cleared the bench with ruthless efficiency. This is gone, this is gone, this is all going. The cast iron vise was the heaviest item on the bench, and when she dragged it toward the donation box she'd positioned near the stairs, its edge caught on the wood with a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space. A sharp crack followed by a groan, followed by a section of the thick oak planking lifting at one end, like a hatch that had been waiting for exactly this amount of force to reveal itself. Eleanor stopped, set down the vise, pressed her fingertips to the lifted edge of the wood, and felt beneath the solid oak surface of the workbench the specific hollow resistance of empty space. Her heart began to move differently. Not faster exactly, more heavily, each beat registering with an awareness she could feel in her ears. She retrieved a flathead screwdriver from the pegboard and wedged it beneath the loosened plank. The wood groaned and splintered and gave way all at once, revealing a cavity roughly the dimensions of a large shoebox sunk into the body of the bench, with such clean edges that it had clearly been constructed, not accidentally formed. Someone had built this space deliberately, with the same precision that had organized the tools above it. Inside was a fireproof metal lockbox, gunmetal gray, secured with a combination padlock. She did not have the combination. She looked at the lockbox for approximately 4 seconds. Then she retrieved the heaviest steel claw hammer from the pegboard and brought it down on the padlock with everything she had. The clang was enormous in the basement. It rang off the concrete walls and the low ceiling, and came back at her from 3 directions. She hit it again. She hit it a 3rd time, and a 4th, and a 5th. And by the 6th blow, she was not thinking about the neighbors, or the structural integrity of the lock mechanism, or what any of this meant. She was simply in her body for the first time since the driveway. Since the paramedics, since the long, terrible week of casseroles and condolences. And her body was doing exactly what it needed to do, which was to break open the thing that was keeping her from the truth. The lock shattered on the 6th strike. Eleanor dropped the hammer. Her breath came in long, ragged pulls. She popped the latch and raised the lid. The first thing she saw was money. A dense stack of $100 bills, bank-banded, resting on top like a paperweight. She moved it aside without counting it. Beneath the cash was a small leather pouch, the kind used for jewelry, drawn closed with a cord. And beneath the pouch, occupying the bottom of the box, with the flat, patient presence of something that has been waiting a long time, was a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. She opened the leather pouch first. The drawstring pulled loose. Out into her palm slid a single key, brass heavier than its size suggested, with an intricate geometric pattern etched into its bow. It looked like a front door key, not the front door of 412 Elmwood Drive. A different door entirely. She set the key on the workbench and reached for the envelope. The wax seal broke cleanly. She drew out the contents and spread them on the ruined surface of the bench. Property documents. A deed of trust, dense with legal language accompanied by years of neatly organized property tax receipts, and utility payment confirmations, each clipped together in chronological order, with the fastidiousness that had characterized everything Walter touched. The property address on every document was the same, 201 Lake Ridge Road, Lake Placid, New York. Eleanor traced the address with one dusty fingertip. Lake Placid. She turned the location over in her mind the way you turn an unfamiliar word looking for context for any hook of recognition. In 38 years of marriage, Walter had never mentioned Lake Placid. They had vacationed in Florida, visited Diana at college in Ohio, once driven to Washington, D.C. for a long weekend that Walter had cut short by a day because of an audit emergency. Upstate New York had never featured in any conversation, any plan, any offhand reference. She looked at the date of purchase. Her eyes went to it twice because the first reading didn't fully register. The property had been acquired 22 years ago, paid in full in cash. 22 years ago was 2002. Eleanor's mind placed herself in 2002 with the involuntary precision of a woman whose life had been organized around seasons and school years. Diana had been 12. They had just completed the difficult, expensive process of enrolling her in the Westfield Academy, a private school with small classes and a strong literature program that Diana had wanted desperately. And then, in March of that year, Walter had come to Eleanor one evening with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a kind of stripped, undefended exhaustion, and told her that his independent auditing firm had hit a serious financial crisis. A major client had terminated their contract. The operating reserves were depleted. They were going to have to make hard decisions. Diana would need to leave Westfield Academy. The renovation plans for the kitchen, the marble countertops, the double oven Eleanor had kept the brochure for in her desk drawer, would have to be abandoned indefinitely. He had looked at her with wet eyes, and she had put her arms around him and told him it was all right, they would get through it together. Money was only money. What mattered was that they had each other. In March of 2002, while Walter sat in their kitchen with wet eyes and asked her to sacrifice their daughter's school enrollment and her own small domestic dream, he was simultaneously completing the cash purchase of a multi-million-dollar lakeside estate 2 states away. Eleanor's legs found the floor. She sat down on the cold concrete of the basement, back against the workbench, and looked at the property documents spread in front of her. She sat there for a very long time. There were 3 photographs at the bottom of the stack Polaroids, with the slightly faded warmth of images from the early 2000s. The first showed the property, a sprawling cedar shingle house with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a glassy expanse of lake surrounded by pine trees, tall enough to make the building look like something that had grown there naturally. The second showed the interior stone fireplace, leather furniture, an oak staircase that curved upward with the unhurried confidence of expensive craftsmanship. The kitchen, visible in the background, had the marble countertops and double oven that Eleanor had kept a brochure for in her desk drawer in 2002 and had quietly discarded in 2003 when it became clear they weren't happening. She picked up the third photograph. Walter looked perhaps 10 years younger than she'd last seen him. He was deeply tanned in the way that comes from sustained outdoor time, not the Florida tourist tan she knew from their own vacations. He was smiling a genuine, relaxed, unperformed smile that she recognized with a jolt of something complicated, as the smile from the early years of their marriage before the business stress and the longer hours and the gradual accretion of a particular kind of tired distance. She hadn't seen that smile in 15 years and had attributed its disappearance to age, to the natural settling of a long partnership. He was standing on the wraparound deck of the lake house, and standing next to him with her arms settled comfortably around his waist was a woman. She appeared to be in her mid-50s in the photograph, which placed her around her late 50s now. Auburn hair, long and well-maintained, the kind of hair that suggests both genetics and investment. She held a glass of red wine and was smiling at the camera with the ease of someone being photographed in her own home. Not a guest, not a visitor. Someone at home in the fullest sense of the phrase. Eleanor looked at the name on the trust documents again, searching for the woman's identity. What she found instead stopped her breath entirely. The trust was not named for the auburn-haired woman. The trust was not named for Crestwood Partners, the foundational legal entity that owned the property at 201 Lake Ridge Road, Lake Placid, New York, purchased in cash, held without mortgage, maintained through 22 years of tax payments and utility bills, was named the Eleanor M. Hargrove Revocable Trust. Her name, her exact name, middle initial included. She turned to the signature page. She had signed documents throughout her marriage tax returns, loan applications, the occasional business form Walter had slid across the dinner table without much explanation. She knew her signature with the intimacy of something that has been reproduced thousands of times. The signature on the foundational trust document was almost perfect. The loops of the E were slightly too tight, the H rising a fraction too high. It was a forgery executed by someone who had watched her sign her name with sufficient frequency to achieve genuine fluency. It would fool a bank officer, a real estate attorney, probably a court clerk. It would not fool Eleanor. She understood now what Walter had done, and the understanding arrived not as revelation, but as the final piece of a structure that had been assembling itself in her peripheral vision for 9 days, possibly for far longer. He had been a forensic accountant by training and practice. He understood exactly how financial crimes were detected and traced. He could not place a multi-million-dollar asset in his own name without generating the kind of paper trail that his own firm was hired to follow. He could not place it in the name of the auburn-haired woman without raising questions about the origin of the funds. But Eleanor had a spotless credit record, no involvement in his business, no financial footprint complex enough to attract scrutiny. Eleanor was clean. Eleanor was, from the perspective of a tax authority or a forensic investigator, the most unimpeachably legitimate identity he could have chosen. He had used her the way a man uses a tool, carefully, precisely, returning it to its outlined position on the pegboard when he was done. And then his heart had given out on a snowy driveway, and he had left her there, with the machinery of his arrangement intact but unguided, and no one at the controls. Because he had legally bound the property to the real Eleanor M. Hargrove the moment his heart stopped beating, Eleanor became the undisputed singular owner of everything he had built in her name. The fortress he had constructed to keep her out had become, by the clean logic of his own legal scheming, the thing that let her in. She rose from the floor. Her knees protested, and she ignored them. She gathered the documents with careful hands, returned them to the manila envelope, tucked the leather pouch and the brass key alongside them, and placed the stack of cash on top. She carried the entire contents of the lockbox upstairs and set it on the kitchen table under the overhead light, and looked at it for a long moment with the evaluating focus of a woman cataloging exactly what she had. She picked up her phone. Diana answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular taut alertness of someone who had been waiting. Con. Eleanor's voice had undergone a change she could feel from the inside. Something had vacated it that had been there for 9 days. Some ambient frequency of distress, and what remained was quieter and considerably more purposeful. I need you to find me a trust and estate lawyer in New York. Not Massachusetts, New York, specifically upstate. Someone who specializes in contested trust administration and asset recovery. The best one you can find, and don't mention this to anyone. Not the bank, not Gerald, not your friends. No one. A pause on the line, then Diana's voice, careful and beginning to understand. Mom, what did you find? Eleanor looked down at the brass key lying on the kitchen table beside the manila envelope and the banded cash and the 3 Polaroid photographs. And for the first time in 14 days, she felt something other than grief occupying the space in her chest. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was something colder and more durable than either of those things, something that had been underneath them all along, waiting for the right angle of force to surface. I found our summer home, she said. Book me a flight to Albany. Caroline Marsh operated out of a 3rd-floor office in Albany that smelled of old paper and radiator heat. The kind of space that announced its occupant had nothing to prove through interior decoration. She was 53 years old, broad-shouldered with close-cropped silver hair, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years watching people arrive with their lives on fire and had learned that panic, however understandable, was not a billable strategy. She had built her practice on exactly the kind of case Eleanor was bringing. Her contested trust administration, forged instruments, hidden assets threaded through shell structures. And when Eleanor spread Walter's documents across the conference table on a Thursday morning, 4 days after the phone call to Diana, Caroline read every page without speaking, without changing her expression, and without once offering the sympathetic commentary that Eleanor had been drowning in for 2 weeks. When she finished, she aligned the documents into a neat stack, set her glasses on top of them, and looked at Eleanor directly. Your husband built you a fortress and then locked himself inside it. The moment he died, the fortress became yours. Every wall, every door, every account attached to this trust. He made you the grantor, the sole trustee, the entire legal architecture of this thing. He did it to hide the money from scrutiny. But the law doesn't care about his intentions. The law reads the document. The document says Eleanor M. Hargrove. Eleanor had expected relief at this confirmation and found instead something colder, the satisfaction of a diagnosis that explains the pain without removing it. What about the woman in the house? Caroline pulled a yellow legal pad toward her. Renee Calloway has no recorded legal interest in that property. No deed, no lease, no title. She's an occupant without standing. Then she added, with the precision of someone who understood that good news delivered incompletely was worse than no news at all. Which means you have the right to reclaim your property. It also means you cannot remove her yourself. New York State requires proper procedure, written notice, a defined vacate timeline for non-lease occupants. However, if she leaves voluntarily, no court order is necessary. And people tend to leave voluntarily when they understand they have nothing left to stay for. Eleanor spent those 4 days in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the woman she had been 3 weeks earlier. She sat across from Caroline for 6 hours over 2 sessions, absorbing the mechanics of trust administration. With the focused intensity of a student who has discovered late in life the precise subject her mind was built for. She was not performing competence, she was genuinely learning quickly. In the way that grief sometimes strips away the accumulated hesitations of a lifetime and leaves the bare processing capacity underneath. She learned what a revocable trust could hold and transfer. She learned how a shell company nested inside a trust could be dissolved or absorbed. She learned what Walter had done technically and sequentially. And in the learning, she found that the architecture of his betrayal, however intricate, was not actually clever. It was paranoid. The kind of structure built by a man who was more afraid of being caught than confident in his own design, which meant it had weaknesses. And the largest weakness was the one he had introduced himself by forging her name onto the foundational document. Diana flew in from Chicago on the 3rd day. She arrived at Eleanor's Albany hotel room with a carry-on bag and a laptop full of annotated bank records, and they sat together on the small sofa near the window, while Diana walked her through what she had assembled. The New York IP address had resolved through a combination of public records and utility registration databases. Diana had navigated through legitimate property search tools to a billing address on Lake Ridge Road in Lake Placid. The same address. The pattern of logins 4 to 5 times per week, consistent over 7 years, suggested not a visitor, but a resident, someone with domestic access to Walter's email account, who had been monitoring it with the regularity of a co-manager. Renee Calloway had not been a secret Walter compartmentalized from his real life. She had been a parallel real life running alongside the one in Concord with the precision of 2 clocks set to different time zones, both keeping perfect time, neither aware of the other's existence. Diana set her laptop aside and looked out the window at the Albany skyline, gray in the late afternoon light. I keep trying to find the moment. Some dinner, some vacation, some ordinary Tuesday where I can say, that's when he decided. That's when it started. But there isn't one. It's been there my whole life, Mom. He was always already doing this. Eleanor looked at her daughter's profile and felt a love so fierce and so helpless, it was almost indistinguishable from sorrow. We are not going to spend what's left of either of our lives trying to locate the moment your father made his choices. We are going to go get what's ours. The drive to Lake Placid took just over 2 hours north from Albany on a Friday morning. The Adirondacks rising around the highway in their late October fullness, rust and amber and deep evergreen. The kind of landscape that continues its indifferent loveliness regardless of what is happening inside the cars moving through it. Eleanor drove. Caroline had given her the complete document package, notarized and organized with a cover letter. establishing her authority as sole trustee of the Eleanor M. Hargrove Revocable Trust. She had Walter's certified death certificate in a separate sleeve. She had the brass key in her coat pocket. She had not told Diana exactly what she intended to do once she arrived. Eleanor understood instinctively that rehearsal would make it a performance, and what she needed it to be was something else entirely. A reckoning does not benefit from blocking and staging. It benefits from truth delivered without preparation, which lands differently than anything scripted. She parked on the shoulder of Lake Ridge Road behind a cluster of birch trees that had shed most of their leaves, leaving a lacework of white branches through which the property was partially visible. The house looked exactly like the Polaroid, and nothing like it. Simultaneously, photographs flattened scale, and the actual structure was larger than she had registered. The cedar shingles weathered to a deep silver gray, the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the morning light off the lake and throwing it back in long horizontal bars. A white Range Rover sat in the circular driveway. Beside it, a dark sedan that had not been in any photograph. Eleanor sat in the parked car and observed with the patience she had been practicing her whole life, now finally deployed in service of her own interests rather than someone else's comfort. At 11:14 in the morning, the dark sedan reversed out of the driveway and headed toward town. She waited another 4 minutes. Then she took the brass key from her coat pocket, got out of the car, and walked up the driveway. The front door was a slab of custom-carved oak, the kind of door that announces the house behind it considers itself permanent. Eleanor climbed the porch steps. She slid the brass key into the deadbolt. The tumblers moved with the smooth, well-maintained click of a lock that had been regularly used, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. She stepped across the threshold, pulled the door closed behind her, and locked it from the inside. The house smelled of cedar smoke and vanilla, and something underneath both the specific signature of a home that has been occupied long enough to absorb its inhabitants. The living room spread out before her, with the unhurried confidence of expensive architecture, vaulted ceiling, wide plank floors. In pale honey oak, a massive sectional angle toward a gas fireplace that was actively burning. On the kitchen island, she could see a half-full coffee mug and an open magazine. Someone had been sitting there 20 minutes ago. She moved through the ground floor with deliberate quiet, not touching anything, only observing. The kitchen had the marble countertops and the double oven from the brochure she had discarded in 2003. She stood in front of them for a moment and felt the specific targeted cruelty of that detail. Not the grand theft of the retirement accounts, not the mortgaged house, but this, the precise domestic object. She had been told she couldn't have installed here, used daily by a woman who had never been told she couldn't have anything. She found the staircase to the second floor and climbed it. The home office was behind French doors at the end of the upper hallway. She stepped inside and moved straight to the mahogany desk. She opened drawers and moved through files with systematic efficiency, utility bills addressed to Renee Calloway, landscaping invoices, property tax records, all paid by corporate account under the name Crestwood Partners. And in the bottom drawer, beneath a ream of blank printer paper, a leather-bound ledger, dark brown, its spine cracked from regular use. She carried it to the desk and opened it. The columns were in Walter's handwriting, that precise, slightly compressed script she had read on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes he sometimes left on the kitchen counter when he left early for the airport. The same handwriting that had forged her signature on the trust documents, though that forging had required a specific deliberate act of imitation, because the rest of his handwriting looked nothing like hers. He had practiced becoming her just enough in just one context, and then returned to being himself in all the others. The ledger was a complete financial map. Crestwood Partners was a shell company, but the ledger showed the plumbing behind the walls in a way the corporate filings had not. Walter had been skimming from client accounts for 15 years. Not dramatically, not in amounts that would trigger immediate audit flags, but consistently with the expert knowledge of a man who understood exactly where the detection thresholds were and how to stay beneath them. The funds moved through a sequence of intermediate accounts, before arriving in Crestwood Partners, which then dispersed them operating costs for the Lake Placid property, the Range Rover, and a regular personal allowance transferred monthly to an account in Renee Calloway's name. She turned to the 2002 entries. There it was, the initial property purchase, recorded in Walter's neat columns as a single cash transfer. In March of that year, the same month, he had sat across from her with wet eyes and asked her to pull Diana out of Westfield Academy. She ran her finger down the column and felt nothing she hadn't already felt in the basement. The shock had already done its work. What she felt now was something closer to the clarity that comes after a fever, breaks the particular lucidity of a mind that has finished being surprised and is gathering itself for what comes next. She photographed every page of the ledger with her phone. Then she returned it to the drawer, positioned it beneath the printer paper, exactly as she had found it, and went back downstairs. She was sitting on the sectional, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the lake, gray and textured with wind, the kind of water that keeps its distance, when she heard the front door. Renee Calloway came in carrying 2 paper bags from a local market. A dry cleaning bag draped over one arm, moving with the unself-conscious efficiency of a person in their own home. She was in her late 50s now. The auburn hair from the Polaroid threaded with silver at the temples, in a way that had clearly been cultivated rather than neglected. She wore expensive wool and carried herself with the particular ease of someone whose comfort had been underwritten for so long that ease had become structural rather than occasional. She set the bags on the kitchen island, hung the dry cleaning on the back of a chair, reached for her coffee mug, turned toward the living room. The mug stopped halfway to her mouth. Eleanor did not stand. She remained seated with her coat folded across her lap and the manila envelope resting beside her, watching Renee process what she was seeing the stranger. On the sectional, the front door closed. The morning suddenly rearranged into something with no precedent. Renee set the mug down, her chin lifted. "Who are you and how did you get in here? I'm going to call the police." Eleanor's voice, when it came, was so calm it seemed to take up less than its normal amount of space in the room. "You won't need the police, Renee, though if you'd like them present while you pack, that's entirely your decision." The sound of her own name in a stranger's mouth landed visibly. Renee's body went still in the way of something encountering a current it hadn't expected. Recognition moved across her face slowly, then all at once the way storms arrive on flat water. Her complexion went through 3 changes in approximately 4 seconds. Defensive color, then white, then a careful, deliberate neutral that cost her visible effort. Eleanor. The name came out at low volume, something between an acknowledgement and an obscenity. In the flesh. Eleanor rose now unhurried. "I apologize for arriving unannounced." Walter always spoke well of the Adirondacks. He never quite got around to mentioning why. Renee's jaw tightened. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket. "I don't know what you think you know, but this is my home. Walter is going to hear about this the moment." She stopped. Something in Eleanor's expression had not changed, had stayed exactly deliberately still in the face of Walter's name. And Renee heard the silence that followed her own unfinished sentence and understood what it meant before Eleanor spoke. Eleanor let her understand it fully. "When did you last speak to Walter?" 2 weeks ago." Renee's phone was still in her hand, her thumb not moving. "He said he had to go back to deal with an audit problem. He said he was finally going to file the papers. We were going to get married. He promised me that was the next step. He was going to tell you officially in January." The information landed in Eleanor's chest with a weight she absorbed without flinching. Walter had promised Renee January. He had promised Eleanor security. He had been constructing promises in both directions simultaneously for 22 years, the way a man might build 2 separate staircases in a house with only 1 floor, each one leading convincingly upward, neither one arriving anywhere. Walter died 14 days ago. Eleanor delivered this without softening or amplification. "Cardiac event. He was shoveling snow in our driveway at 6 in the morning. We buried him last Tuesday." She watched Renee's face. The dry cleaning bag slipped from the back of the chair in the silence that followed, landing on the kitchen floor in a soft collapse that no one moved to address. Renee's hand found the edge of the kitchen island. The phone went down. Her face did not break in the way Eleanor might have expected. There was no immediate dissolution. What appeared instead was something more frightening. The look of a person doing rapid structural calculations on a building she has just been told is already falling. That's not possible. He had a physical in September. The cardiologist said the underlying condition had been developing for years, undetected. Eleanor held Renee's gaze steadily. "He didn't update his estate documents in your favor, Renee. Whatever he promised you about January, he ran out of time." The calculation behind Renee's eyes accelerated. Eleanor could see it happening, the inventory of what she had, what she could claim, what legal ground she was standing on. A woman who had lived in a house for a decade without a lease, without a deed, without a single document bearing her name attached to this address except utility bills, routed through a company that bore someone else's identity entirely. Renee knew something was wrong with her position. What she didn't know yet was the full geometry of how wrong. Eleanor picked up the manila envelope from the sectional cushion. She walked to the kitchen island and placed it between them. "I'd like you to look at the name at the top of the foundational trust document." Renee stared at the envelope without touching it. Then she opened it. She drew out the stack of documents with careful hands and read the header. Her manicured finger traced the words slowly, as if her eyes might have made an error that physical contact could correct. "He forged my signature," Eleanor said, her tone conversational, almost gentle, the way a surgeon explains a procedure to a patient who needs to understand what is about to happen. "He needed a clean legal identity to shield the asset from scrutiny and from his firm's clients. Mine was the cleanest available. He built the entire structure on my name, the trust, the subsidiary company, the property, the investment accounts. He thought he had 20 more years to reorganize it in his own time. He didn't." Renee was still reading, flipping through pages, her expression cycling through stages of comprehension that each arrived worse than the last. Her voice, when it surfaced, was thinner, stripped of its earlier authority. "Crestwood Partners, these accounts are wholly owned subsidiaries of my trust," Eleanor said, "which makes them mine. The house, the accounts, the Range Rover in the driveway. Everything purchased through that corporate structure belongs to the trust. The trust belongs to me." Renee looked up. The woman Eleanor was looking at now was not the woman who had walked through the front door with dry cleaning and a market bag. What Eleanor recognized in her face, because she had been looking at a version of it in the mirror for 2 weeks, was the expression of a person who has just been handed irrefutable evidence that the ground she was standing on had never been as solid as it felt. The difference between them, Eleanor noted with a clarity that carried neither satisfaction nor cruelty, was simply this: Renee had chosen to be here. She had chosen, Walter had accepted the terms of an arrangement that kept her comfortable and unquestioning, had not asked the questions whose answers would have been inconvenient. Eleanor had not chosen any of what had been done to her. That distinction did not resolve the practical situation they were both standing in, but it resolved something in Eleanor, some final question about what she owed this woman, which was the truth which she had now provided, and nothing further. She was gathering the documents back into the envelope when the front door opened again. Marcus Holt was in his mid-40s, wearing a wool overcoat, and he arrived with the contained energy of a man who had been called away from something else and was prepared to be aggressive on his client's behalf. He was Renee's attorney, based in Lake Placid, and he looked at Eleanor and then at the documents on the island with the rapid professional assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating situations at speed. He read the foundational trust document standing up. His posture changed twice during the reading. First, a small stiffening, then a gradual reluctant loosening, as the implications of what he was holding became undeniable. He asked Eleanor 3 questions in rapid succession, each one a different angle on the same core issue, the grantor identity. the trustee succession clause, the death certificate establishing Walter's passing. Eleanor answered each one without consulting Caroline's materials because she had spent 4 days learning exactly these answers. Holt set the document down and turned to Renee. He spoke at low volume, but the kitchen was not a large space. There is no instrument bearing your name attached to this property or any of its subsidiary holdings. Adverse possession requires open, hostile, and continuous use for 10 years under New York law. But it cannot apply against a trust where the beneficiary has just established active administration. A challenge would take years and cost more than you have available without the Crestwood accounts, which are now frozen pending trustee succession. He paused. Renee, there's nothing here to fight with. Renee turned towards the window. The lake was visible through the glass, steel gray and indifferent. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and stripped of its territorial certainty. What remained was something raw, something Eleanor almost recognized. I've lived here for 10 years. I decorated this house. I believed him. I gave him the years that mattered. Eleanor looked at her steadily. I gave him 40. Not as a weapon, as the only fact that needed to be said. Holt touched his client's arm. Renee straightened. She looked at Eleanor one last time with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, resentment and a devastated species of recognition. The look of a woman seeing in another woman's face, the same con job, the same practiced sincerity, the same vanishing act, differently staged. She picked up her keys from the kitchen counter. She carried herself up the stairs without looking back. The sounds that followed drawers, closet doors, the percussion of a life being reduced to what fits in luggage, filled the house for the next hour and a half. Eleanor sat at the kitchen island and drank a glass of water and watched the lake. When the white Range Rover backed down the driveway and disappeared into the pine trees, she did not feel triumph. She felt the specific exhausted weight of a thing that needed to be done and was now done, which is its own distinct category of feeling, and not always a comfortable one. She called Diana from the kitchen island. The conversation was brief. She gave her daughter the figures Caroline had confirmed, the liquid assets in the operating account, the investment portfolio numbers, the estimated property value. She heard Diana's silence stretch long enough to mean something. Then Diana's voice, careful and beginning to fracture at the edges. Mom, if Dad was skimming from clients for 15 years and your name is on all those trust documents, the IRS, they're going to look at you. Eleanor set her glass down on the marble counter. Outside, the first stars were appearing over the lake, the temperature dropping in the way it drops in the Adirondacks in late October. Quickly, without apology, as though warmth had been a temporary courtesy. She looked at the kitchen that had been built with money stolen from her life and felt the full, complicated weight of what it meant that she was still here, still thinking, still capable of the next move. Her daughter was right. The fortress Walter had built in Eleanor's name was hers now, and so were its liabilities. The question was whether she would wait for that to arrive or move toward it first on her own terms before it came looking for her. She already knew the answer. She had known it since the basement floor. The IRS field office in Albany occupied the 4th floor of a federal building that had been designed apparently to communicate the government's indifference to natural light. Eleanor arrived at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning in January, 3 months after she had driven north from Albany into the Adirondacks for the first time. And she arrived with Caroline Marsh beside her and a document portfolio that weighed 4.5 pounds. She had weighed it on the kitchen scale at the lake house that morning because she had needed something concrete to do with her hands while the coffee brewed. 4.5 pounds of evidence that she had assembled, organized, and delivered of her own volition before anyone had come looking. That was the decision she had made on the night Renee left, sitting at the Marble Island with Diana's warning still resonating in the silence. She had sat with it for exactly 1 hour, long enough to examine it from every angle Caroline had prepared her, for long enough to feel the fear that lived inside it, and determine that the fear was manageable, that it was in fact smaller than the alternative. The alternative was waiting. waiting while the forensic accountants at Walter's former firm inevitably found the discrepancies, while some investigator followed the paper trail to a name her name and arrived at her door with a set of assumptions already formed. She had spent 38 years waiting for other people to determine the shape of her days. She was not going to wait for this. Caroline had called it a proactive disclosure strategy, which was the technical term for what Eleanor understood simply as get there first and tell the truth loudly enough that no one can tell it against you. They had spent 6 weeks preparing. Caroline brought in a forensic accountant named Robert Griggs, a compact, meticulous man in his 60s who had spent 20 years at the SEC before entering private practice, and who approached Walter's ledger with the focused appreciation of a craftsman examining another craftsman's work, noting the technical precision even while cataloging its crimes. Griggs produced a complete reconstruction of the financial movement. Every skim, every transfer, every layer of the shell structure traced back to its origin and forward to its destination. The report was 112 pages. Eleanor read all of it. She read it because Caroline had advised her to, and she also read it because she needed to know. She needed the full accounting in the same way she had needed to open the lockbox, not because the information was comfortable, but because comfortable was no longer the operating standard. The woman who had deferred the specifics of her own financial life to a man she trusted was not the woman sitting at the kitchen table in Lake Placid at 11 o'clock at night with a forensic accounting report and a yellow highlighter. That first woman had been replaced not gradually, but in the specific moment a cast iron vise caught on an oak plank, and the floor gave way beneath a lie that had been standing for 22 years. Agent Douglas Crane had received the disclosure package in advance and had 6 days to review it before Eleanor walked through the door. He was 50 lean, with the specific stillness of someone trained to observe rather than react. And he received Eleanor and Caroline in a conference room with a long laminate table and a window that looked out onto a ventilation shaft. He had the package open in front of him, tabbed with colored markers in a pattern that told Eleanor he had read it thoroughly and had organized his questions in advance. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Crane asked his questions in a sequence that moved from the periphery inward, beginning with the structure of the trust and advancing toward the central issue of Eleanor's knowledge. Caroline answered the structural questions. Eleanor answered the questions about knowledge because those required her voice, specifically not her lawyer's paraphrase, but her own direct account delivered without hedging in plain declarative sentences that left no interpretive space. The first hour felt manageable, but in the second hour, Crane's question shifted tone. He returned 3 times to a gap in the timeline, a period in 2019, when Crestwood Partners had received a transfer that Griggs' report had not fully accounted for, a sum that fell between the documented client skimming and the property operating costs with no clear allocation. Crane set the relevant ledger page in front of Eleanor and asked her directly whether she had any knowledge of what that transfer represented. Eleanor looked at the page. She had looked at this page before at the Lake House kitchen table at 2 in the morning, and she had not been able to explain it then either. "I don't know what that transfer represents," she said. "I have given you everything I found. If there is an allocation I cannot account for, it is because Walter did not document it, and I was not privy to it. I was not privy to any of this." Crane held her gaze for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. The room was very quiet. Caroline's pen was still. Eleanor did not look away because looking away from the truth, even when the truth was incomplete, was the habit she was leaving behind. Crane made a note. He moved to his next question. The unexplained transfer hung in the air of the room for the remainder of the meeting, unresolved, a small, persistent uncertainty that reminded Eleanor that Walter's architecture had corners she still hadn't mapped, and that some of them might never be fully illuminated. This was not the clean exoneration she had imagined in her more optimistic moments. This was the messier, more realistic version, mostly cleared, one loose thread remaining, the investigation continuing around it. At the end of the meeting, Crane closed his folder. Mrs. Hargrove, the documentation you've provided is comprehensive, and it corroborates your account at every material point. The forgery finding substantially alters the complexion of this case. He paused. You are not a target of this investigation. You are a witness and a victim. I'll have that in writing to your counsel by the end of the week. The unexplained 2019 transfer remains an open item in our review. We may need to speak with you again as that develops. Eleanor thanked him. She stood, gathered her coat, and walked out of the conference room and down the hallway and into the elevator with Caroline. And it was only when the elevator doors closed and they were alone in the small descending box that she put one hand against the wall and let out a breath that had been accumulating since October. Not relief exactly, more like the specific release of a tension that has been load-bearing for so long, the body had forgotten it was there. Caroline put a hand briefly on her shoulder and said nothing, because nothing was required. Diana was waiting in the lobby. She had flown in from Chicago the night before and had offered twice to come upstairs for the meeting, and Eleanor had declined both times. The version of Eleanor Hargrove who had always had someone else in front of her, Walter handling the finances, Gerald managing the estate, that woman had been retired. What replaced her was someone who signed her own name in her own handwriting on her own terms. Diana looked at her mother's face as she crossed the lobby and asked nothing, because Eleanor's expression answered the question before it could be formed. They walked out into the January cold together, and Diana reached over and took her mother's arm, and Eleanor let her. And they stood for a moment on the building's front steps while Albany moved around them in the grey winter light. And the feeling between them was not celebratory. It was something quieter and more durable than celebration. It was the feeling of two people who have walked through the same fire from opposite directions and arrived scorched but intact at the same clearing. Robert Griggs spent the following 8 weeks working with Eleanor and Caroline to establish the legal boundaries of the estate with a precision that would withstand any subsequent scrutiny. The client accounts Walter had skimmed from required restitution that was not negotiable, and Eleanor had not attempted to negotiate it. The money belonged to the clients. She arranged the restitution through the trust assets, carving it out first, before any other disposition, because it was the right sequence, and because she understood that her own claim to the remaining assets rested in part on the visible clarity of that moral arithmetic. She was not keeping stolen money. She was keeping the legal property of a trust that bore her name because a man had forged her identity to construct it, and she was prepared to defend that distinction in any room that asked her to. What remained after restitution was still, by any measure, Eleanor had operated within for 68 years, a sum that reshaped her understanding of her own future, not with the dizzy relief she might have expected, but with a sober, deliberate intentionality, as though she were learning to navigate a room whose dimensions she was still mapping. The Lake Placid property appraised in December at just under $3 million. The investment portfolio reduced by the restitution payments, but still carrying a balance of just over $2 million. The operating account with its liquid reserves. The total was not a windfall. It was a reckoning, an accounting of what her life had been worth to a man who had spent 38 years telling her she didn't need to know the numbers. The house in Concord was the first thing she settled. She paid off the outstanding mortgages in full and transferred the deed directly into Diana's name. Gerald Pittman processed the transfer because he remained the estate attorney of record, and the paperwork required his involvement. But he processed it with a deference so complete it bordered on apology, which was its own form of acknowledgement, and Eleanor accepted it without commentary. The house had been the site of her marriage, her domestic labor, her daughter's childhood, and the gradual invisible theft of her financial future. She felt no particular need to keep it. What she felt watching the transfer complete was the relief that arrives not in the moment of release, but in the sudden awareness of how much had been weighing on you. The kind of weight you stop noticing because carrying it has become indistinguishable from simply being alive. Diana cried when the deed was transferred. Eleanor held her daughter for a long time in the kitchen of the Concord house on the last day. Eleanor spent inside it surrounded by the boxes of a life in transit and felt the full weight of what 38 years in a place amounted to, not the betrayal, not the theft, but the actual accumulation of ordinary time, which is its own kind of irreplaceable thing and belongs to you regardless of what else was happening around it. That time had been real. The hydrangeas had been real. Diana learning to ride a bicycle on the front path had been real. Eleanor was not going to allow Walter's choices to retroactively hollow out every ordinary morning of the life she had actually lived. She hired contractors for the Lake Placid house in February. The renovation was not extensive. The bones of the structure were sound. The quality of construction Walter had paid for being one of the few things about the place she could acknowledge without complication. What she changed was the interior systematically and without sentiment. The decor Renee Calloway had assembled over a decade ran to expensive comfort, heavy textures, saturated colors, the visual language of someone who had been given money without context and had spent it toward warmth. Eleanor's taste was different. She wanted light. She wanted the lake visible from every room on the ground floor, which required repositioning two interior walls and replacing the window treatments entirely. She wanted bookshelves floor to ceiling on the east wall of the living room, the kind she had sketched in the margins of her graduate school notebooks in 1979 before she had decided or been persuaded that the life requiring them was not the one she was going to live. The bookshelves went in March. She stood in front of them on the first day. They were complete empty pale oak running the full height of the wall in the afternoon light coming off the lake, and felt something she recognized after a moment as a very old specific hunger. The kind that survives decades of not being fed because it is part of the structure of the person, rather than a product of circumstance. She had wanted a room like this since she was 26 years old. She was 68. The math of the delay was not something she was going to spend time mourning. She was going to fill the shelves. Gerald Pittman's situation resolved itself through the State Bar Association's inquiry process over the spring. Eleanor had not filed the complaint. The inquiry opened on the basis of findings that had surfaced enough irregularity in the estate documents to generate a referral. She was contacted twice for information and provided it both times without elaboration or embellishment. She held no particular animus toward Gerald. He had been Walter's instrument in a limited and probably technically legal sense, a man who had not asked the questions he should have asked because Walter had been a client for 10 years and the relationship had its own comfortable momentum. The Bar Association would determine what that amounted to. It was not Eleanor's determination to make. Renee Calloway she did not pursue. This was a decision she had made in the kitchen on the night Renee left, and she had not revisited it. Renee had been Walter's instrument in a different and more intimate sense, and she had paid for it in ways that were not Eleanor's to adjudicate, paid in years in misplaced trust, in the specific humiliation of discovering that the man who had promised you a future had been running exactly the same promise in another state simultaneously, with the same practiced sincerity for longer than you had known him. Eleanor felt no warmth toward Renee Calloway. She also felt no need to extend the damage. Whatever Renee did with the remainder of her life was Renee's own architecture to build. The scholarship fund was Diana's idea, offered quietly one evening in April, when they were sitting on the veranda watching the ice on the lake complete its slow spring retreat. Diana had been thinking about the name on the trust documents, the Eleanor M. Hargrove Revocable Trust. The name forged onto a foundation of stolen money, and she said it seemed like a reasonable ambition to make sure that name attached to something that pointed in the opposite direction. Eleanor had looked at her daughter in the fading light and felt again the particular fierce, helpless love that has no adequate expression. They established the Eleanor M. Hargrove Literary Scholarship through the University of Massachusetts, awarded annually to a first-generation college student pursuing graduate work in literature. The endowment was funded from the Lake Placid operating account. The paperwork required Eleanor to sign her name 14 times, and she signed it each time with full, unhurried attention. The loops of the E precisely where she had always put them, the H at exactly the height it had always been. Her signature. Hers alone. It was a Thursday evening in late April. 6 months to the week from the morning she had watched the paramedics work in the driveway when Eleanor received the call. She was on the veranda with a book and a glass of wine, the lake open and darkening in front of her, the pine trees on the far shore just beginning to show their first new green. The phone number was unfamiliar, a 518 area code, upstate New York. She answered it because she had been answering unfamiliar numbers for 6 months without flinching, which was itself a small measure of how much had changed. The voice on the other end was Renee Calloway's. It was recognizable immediately, that particular low register now carrying something Eleanor could only characterize as careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say and is still not certain it is the right thing to say. Renee apologized for calling. She said she understood if Eleanor hung up. She said she had found something when she packed something among Walter's personal papers that she had taken without fully registering what it was, and that she had held on to for months, trying to decide what to do with it. She had finally decided that Eleanor should have it because it belonged to Eleanor's understanding of what had happened. "I don't want anything from you," Renee said, and Eleanor believed her. "I just think you should see it." Eleanor looked at the lake. The last of the evening light was sitting on the water in long copper bands, the same light that had been coming off this lake for centuries before Walter had bought the view, and decades before Eleanor had inherited it. She thought about what a document retrieved from Walter's private papers might contain: another layer of the architecture, another account, another proof of something she had not yet been told. She thought about whether she wanted to know. She decided, as she had been deciding since October, that the answer to that question was always yes. That not knowing was the condition she was leaving behind her. That the woman who had accepted the shape of her own life as something managed by someone else was retired, and the woman who had replaced her did not decline information. "Send it to Caroline Marsh." Eleanor told her, "You have her contact information." A pause on the line. Then Renee's voice, very quiet. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. For what it's worth, I didn't know about you, not really. Not in any way that would have changed my choices, but I didn't know the full shape of what he was doing to you." Eleanor considered this. She considered whether it was true, whether partial ignorance constituted any meaningful form of innocence, whether the apology was offered in genuine contrition or in the hope of absolution. She decided it didn't matter which. An apology offered at no cost to the receiver could be accepted at no cost to the receiver. "I know you didn't," Eleanor said, and then, because it was the truest thing she could offer, "He was very good at managing what people knew." She ended the call, set the phone down on the arm of the veranda chair, picked up her wine glass. The copper light on the lake held for another few minutes. Then the sun dropped below the tree line and took it with it, and the water became a deep, still gray, beautiful in the way of things that do not require an audience, that simply continue being what they are, regardless of who is watching. Eleanor looked at it and felt for the first time in 6 months something that was not grief or calculation, or the specific exhaustion of a woman rebuilding a life from salvaged materials. What she felt was simpler than any of those things, and had been available to her, she suspected, for a very long time, waiting for the noise to clear. She felt like herself. She felt specifically like the version of herself who had existed before 38 years of careful management had convinced her that other people's comfort was the primary object of her attention. That woman had wanted bookshelves. She had wanted a room with light and a view of water and time that belonged to no one's schedule but her own. The brass key sat on the kitchen windowsill, inside where she had placed it on the first morning she woke up in this house as its owner. She had considered what to do with it. Put it away. Repurpose it, throw it into the lake with the symbolic finality of a gesture that would have read well in a story. She had done none of those things. She had put it on the windowsill where the morning light found it, and she looked at it every day when she made coffee. And what it represented to her now was not what it had represented in the basement in October. In the basement, it had been a secret waiting to be broken open. On the windowsill, it was something simpler and more personal evidence that a woman who had been managed and kept and carefully limited for most of her adult life had walked into a room she was told was not hers, picked up the tools available to her and broken open the lock, not because someone gave her permission, not because the circumstances were convenient, because the truth was on the other side. And she had decided at 68 years old, standing on a cold concrete floor with a hammer in her hand, and 38 years of compliance finally running out, that she was done waiting for someone else to open the door. She refilled her glass. She opened her book. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Adirondacks, arriving the way they always arrived, without asking permission, without announcement, simply becoming visible as the dark deepened around them, as though they had been there the whole time, and the world had only just remembered to look up.